Jungkook and Taehyung reveal the bitter struggles and hilarious moments of BTS's early days in an exclusive podcast. Dark secrets and laughter. Ready to listen? I thought that was the end for me, Hyung. Jungkook's voice trembled as he leaned closer to the mic, his fingers gripping the edge of the wooden podcast table. The dim studio lights flickered slightly, casting shadows over Taehyung's face. His eyes, usually warm and playful, darkened with an emotion that made the air between them feel heavier. Taehyung let out a slow breath. "I remember that night too well," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of something unsaid. "The rain, the empty streets, and the way you just—" He stopped, shaking his head as if the memory itself was too much to process. Silence hung between them, thick and loaded. The podcast listeners wouldn't see their faces, but they would hear it in their voices. The rawness, the scars left by a past neither of them spoke about often. 10 years ago, the night was cold, Seoul's neon lights reflecting in the puddles along the narrow alleyway behind the training center. Jungkook, only 15 at the time, stood frozen, his breath coming out in shaky clouds. His thin hoodie was soaked through, clinging to his shivering frame. His hands were bruised, his knuckles scraped from the hours of relentless practice. A door slammed open behind him. Footsteps. Urgent. Desperate. Jungkook. Taehyung's voice was sharp, frantic. "What are you doing out here?" Jungkook didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, his shoulders rising and falling unevenly. Taehyung grabbed his wrist, forcing him to look up. "You can't just run out like that. You scared the hell out of everyone." Jungkook's lips parted, but no words came out. His throat was tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but all he could hear was the echo of their coach's voice ringing in his head. "You're not good enough. Maybe this isn't for you." And maybe, just maybe, he had started to believe it. "If you leave now, there's no coming back." The words rang in Jungkook's ears, colder than the Seoul night air biting his skin. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his bruised palms. The rain dripped from his soaked hoodie, pooling at his feet, but he barely felt it. His mind was a storm of its own doubt, exhaustion, and something heavier that he didn't dare name. Across from him, Taehyung's grip on his wrist tightened. His eyes, sharp under the flickering streetlight, burned with something fierce. "Say something, Jungkook." Jungkook swallowed hard. What was there to say? He had spent years chasing this dream, leaving home at 15, sacrificing his childhood, pushing his body past its limits. And now, their coach's words echoed in his head like a death sentence. Maybe this isn't for you. Maybe they were right. Maybe he wasn't strong enough. A taxi slowed down at the curb. Its headlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement, the open door an invitation. One step and he could leave. One step and the pain would stop. Taehyung must have sensed it the moment Jungkook almost moved. "If you get in that car, I swear." His voice broke, and for the first time that night, Jungkook saw it, the fear in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. Jungkook froze. "Hyung." Taehyung exhaled, his shoulders tense. "Do you really think you're alone in this?" He let go of Jungkook's wrist, only to grab the front of his hoodie. "Do you think you're the only one struggling?" Silence. The sound of rain. The distant honk of a car. Then, a voice cut through the night. "Jungkook." Both of them turned. Under the glow of the streetlights, a figure stood at the entrance of the alley, his face partially hidden beneath the hood of his black jacket. The tension in Taehyung's body shifted instantly. His grip on Jungkook loosened, his breath caught. Jungkook blinked, his mind struggling to process. He hadn't seen this person in years. "Hyung?" The man took a slow step forward. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? You should have never come back." Taehyung's voice was low, almost a whisper, but the weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. His entire body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, yet the air felt heavier, charged with something electric, something dangerous. Jungkook couldn't move. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the man in front of them. Hyung. The word barely left his lips, uncertain, as if saying it aloud would make the past come rushing back too fast, too violently. The man stepped forward, his hood slipping just enough for the dim streetlight to catch his face. Min Yongi, a name they hadn't spoken in years, a name they weren't sure they were even allowed to remember. His expression was unreadable, eyes sharp but shadowed, his hands tucked into the pockets of his black jacket. He looked different, older, harder, not the same quiet, brooding trainee they had once looked up to. Taehyung's jaw tightened. What do you want? Yongi tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. That's a cold way to greet an old friend. Jungkook exhaled shakily. Friend. Was that what they were? Because last he remembered, Yongi had vanished without a trace. One day they were training side by side, chasing the same impossible dream. The next, he was gone, like he had never existed at all.
No goodbyes. No explanations.
Just silence. And now, out of nowhere, he was standing here. Jungkook found his voice. Where have you been? Yongi's eyes flicked to him, and for a split second, something softened in his gaze. But it was gone just as quickly. It doesn't matter. Taehyung scoffed, his frustration barely contained. Bullshit. Yongi let out a quiet chuckle, the sound dry, almost bitter. You haven't changed, Taehyung. Taehyung took a step forward, fists clenched. And you have? You disappeared. Hyung. We thought. He cut himself off, shaking his head. You don't just get to walk back in like nothing happened. Yongi's expression darkened, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, edged with something Jungkook couldn't quite place. I never left. A chill ran down Jungkook's spine. What do you mean? Yongi sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like he was debating whether to say it. Then he met their eyes, serious, unwavering. You think I disappeared? No, I was erased. Silence. Jungkook's breath caught. He didn't understand. Erased? Yongi took another step closer, his voice almost a whisper now. You think the industry lets people just walk away? His gaze flickered between them. There are things you don't know. Things you were never supposed to know. Taehyung's hands trembled at his sides. What the hell are you talking about? Yongi's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. If I tell you, you might not like the answer. Jungkook's heart pounded. He could feel it, that feeling just before something shatters, before a truth too big to ignore comes crashing down. He swallowed hard. Tell us anyway. You were never supposed to debut. The words hit harder than a punch. Jungkook felt the air leave his lungs. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but his body refused to move. His mind scrambled to process what Yongi had just said, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. Taehyung was the first to react. What the hell is that supposed to mean? His voice was sharp, laced with something raw, anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. Yongi's face remained unreadable. Exactly what I said. He took a slow breath, as if choosing his next words carefully. None of you were. The streetlight above them flickered, casting long shadows over the alleyway. The rain had stopped, but the cold still clung to Jungkook's skin. That's impossible, Jungkook muttered. His voice felt distant, like it didn't belong to him. We trained for years. We were chosen. Yongi let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. You think you were chosen? His gaze locked onto them, sharp as a blade.
No, Jungkook.
You were a mistake. Silence. Something twisted in Jungkook's chest, tight and suffocating. Taehyung stepped forward, his breathing uneven. You're lying. Yongi shook his head. I wish I was. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, something old. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. He held it out, but neither Jungkook nor Taehyung moved to take it. Yongi sighed. Read it. Jungkook hesitated before finally reaching for it. His fingers shook as he unfolded the paper, revealing a list of names. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't their names. It was a list of trainees, ones they recognized, ones they had trained alongside. But none of them were in BTS. And at the bottom of the list, scrawled in small, almost unreadable handwriting, were 3 words that made Jungkook's blood run cold. Final lineup approved. Taehyung snatched the paper from him, scanning the names, his expression darkening. This isn't right. It's the truth, Yongi said quietly. The 7 of you weren't supposed to be the group. The real BTS never debuted. Jungkook shook his head. But why? Yongi's jaw tightened. Because the company made a deal. Taehyung's eyes snapped up. A deal? Yongi exhaled, running a hand through his hair. A deal to replace the original lineup. A deal that involved people who didn't want you to succeed. A deal that almost cost me everything. The world tilted. Jungkook felt his stomach churn. Taehyung's voice was barely a whisper now. Who made the deal? Yongi hesitated. For the first time that night, his composure cracked. His eyes darkened. And when he spoke again, his voice was edged with something almost like regret. Bang PD. Jungkook's breath hitched. Taehyung staggered back a step.
No.
He shook his head. You're lying. He believed in us. Yongi's expression was pained. And that's exactly what he wanted you to think. Jungkook's heart pounded so hard it hurt. The man who had given them everything, their dream, their future, had also been the one to hide the biggest secret of all? Yongi shoved his hands into his pockets. I left because I knew too much, because I started asking questions. And the second I did, he let out a slow breath. I became a problem. Jungkook felt sick. Hyung. Yongi looked at him, something almost like sadness flickering in his eyes. I came back to warn you, Jungkook. He glanced at Taehyung, then back at him. Because if you keep digging, if you keep pushing, his voice dropped to a whisper. They'll erase you too. If they know we're talking about this, we're dead. Yongi's words lingered in the cold air, sinking deep into Jungkook's bones. He wanted to believe this was all a sick joke, a twisted story spun by a ghost from their past. But the look in Yongi's eyes told him otherwise. Taehyung ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. So what, Hyung? You're saying we were never meant to make it? That the real BTS got replaced and we just, what? Took their place without knowing. Yongi's jaw tightened. It's not that simple. He glanced around the dark alley, his posture stiffening. But I shouldn't be telling you this here. Jungkook's brows furrowed. Why? Yongi's gaze snapped to him, his voice low and urgent. Because they're watching. A chill ran down Jungkook's spine. Taehyung scoffed. Come on, Hyung. That sounds like... I'm not joking, Taehyung. Yongi hissed, stepping closer. Do you think they'd let me walk away if they weren't keeping tabs on me? Do you think they won't do the same to you once they realize I've told you? Jungkook's fingers twitched. His pulse hammered in his ears. Yongi's voice dropped even lower. Look around. Slowly. Jungkook swallowed hard and did as he was told, his heart racing. The streets were nearly empty, the neon lights from the stores casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. At first, everything seemed normal, until he saw it. A black car, parked just across the street. Tinted windows, no visible driver. His breath caught. Taehyung stiffened beside him. He had seen it too. Yongi's expression darkened. That car has been following me for the past 3 days. Jungkook felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, suffocating. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Could this really be happening? Could someone really be watching them? Taehyung took a shaky breath. Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say they're watching you. His voice was quieter now, controlled. Why come to us? Why risk everything to tell us this? Yongi hesitated. Then, for the first time that night, his composure cracked. Because I can't do this alone. Jungkook's chest tightened. Yongi's gaze flickered between them. If I disappear again, someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to finish what I started. The weight of his words sank deep. Jungkook clenched his fists, his mind screaming at him to run, to pretend he never heard any of this. But he couldn't, because the second he looked at Taehyung, he knew his Hyung was thinking the exact same thing. They were already in too deep. Then suddenly, phone rang, loud, shrill, cutting through the thick silence. Yongi's entire body went rigid. He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the screen. His face paled. Jungkook took a step forward. Hyung? Yongi didn't move. His grip on the phone tightened. Then slowly he turned the screen toward them. A single message flashed on the screen. You shouldn't have told them. Jungkook's blood turned to ice. Taehyung's breath hitched. They know. Yongi shoved the phone back into his pocket, his voice urgent. We need to leave. Now. Jungkook barely had time to react before Yongi grabbed his wrist, pulling him into the shadows of the alley. Taehyung was right behind them, his footsteps fast, unsteady. Jungkook's heart pounded as they ran. And behind them, the black car's engine roared to life. The black car's engine roared to life. And they ran. Jungkook's lungs burned as his feet pounded against the wet pavement. The neon glow of Seoul streets blurred past him. But he didn't dare look back. The only sound louder than the storm in his chest was the steady, menacing hum of the car following close behind. Faster! Yongi hissed, gripping Jungkook's wrist and yanking him into a narrow alleyway. Taehyung followed, nearly slipping on the slick concrete. The three of them pressed against the cold brick wall, panting. The alley was dark, barely wide enough to fit them, but it wasn't enough. The car stopped at the entrance. The low hum of the engine sent a chill down Jungkook's spine. For a moment, nothing happened. Just silence. Then, the car door clicked open. Jungkook held his breath. A pair of polished black shoes stepped onto the pavement. Then another. A figure emerged from the car, dressed in a sleek suit, his face hidden under the dim glow of a street lamp. He wasn't just some random stranger. He knew them. Yongi's grip on Jungkook's arm tightened. His voice was barely a whisper. Shit, it's him. Jungkook's stomach twisted. Him? The man took a slow step forward. Then another. Min Yongi. The voice was smooth, calculated. Dangerous. I warned you. Yongi stepped in front of Jungkook and Taehyung, shielding them. Stay out of this, he muttered. The man chuckled. You always were stubborn. His gaze shifted past Yongi, locking onto Jungkook. And you, the golden magne, how much did he tell you? Jungkook's breath hitched. Taehyung clenched his fists. Enough. The man tilted his head. Then you know what happens next. The moment stretched, suffocating. Then, a sharp metallic click. Jungkook's blood ran cold. The man had pulled something from his coat. Small, black, a gun. Run. Yongi's voice was sharp, urgent. Jungkook didn't think. He grabbed Taehyung's wrist, and they bolted. Behind them, the alley exploded in sound. A gunshot.
Jungkook s'y rend.
His heartbeat slammed against his ribs as he turned the corner, not daring to look back. He could hear Yongi right behind them, his breath ragged. Then, a cry, a stumble. Jungkook spun around just in time to see Yongi clutching his shoulder, blood staining his sleeve. Hyung! Yongi gritted his teeth. Keep running. But Jungkook couldn't move. The man in the suit stepped forward, the gun still in his hand, his expression calm. This isn't personal, he said. But you were never supposed to know. Jungkook's hands shook. His mind screamed at him to do something. Fight, run, anything. But he was frozen. Taehyung stepped in front of him, his voice unsteady but defiant. We're not going anywhere with you. The man sighed. You don't have a choice. Another gunshot. But this time it wasn't from him. A second figure appeared at the end of the alley, a hood pulled low over their face. Their gun was aimed directly at the suited man. Let them go. Jungkook's breath caught. The voice. It was familiar. The man in the suit hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the car. The engine roared to life, and just like that, he was gone. Silence. Just their ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. Jungkook turned to the hooded figure, his pulse still racing. Who? His voice barely worked. Who are you? The figure stepped forward, lowering their hood. Jungkook's heart nearly stopped. It was someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone they all thought had vanished.
Kim Seok-shin.
They lied to you. They lied to all of us. Kim Sikjin stood before them, his face half hidden in the dim alley light, his gun still raised. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable. Nothing like the Jeon they remembered. Jungkook felt his world tilt. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. His mind refused to accept what he was seeing. Hyung? Sikjin's eyes flicked to him, and for a brief moment, something softened in his gaze. But it was gone just as quickly. He turned to Yongi, who was still gripping his wounded shoulder. You're lucky it's just a graze. Taehyung's breath was shaky. You're alive. Sikjin let out a quiet scoff. Barely. Jungkook swallowed hard. Where the hell have you been? Silence. Sikjin sighed, tucking his gun into the waistband of his jeans. That's a long story, and we don't have time. He glanced at the entrance of the alley, his posture tense. They'll be back. We need to move. Yongi gritted his teeth. Why should we trust you? Sikjin met his gaze. Because I know who they are. His voice was cold. And I know what they did to me. Jungkook felt his pulse spike. What are you talking about? Sikjin took a slow breath, then turned to them fully. His eyes were dark, unreadable. You think I left on my own? That I just walked away from BTS? Taehyung tensed. That's what they told us. Sikjin let out a bitter laugh. Of course they did. He shook his head. The truth is, I never left. Jungkook's stomach dropped. Yongi's fists clenched. Then where the hell were you? Sikjin's gaze hardened. Locked away. Silence crashed down like a thunderclap. Jungkook could barely process what he was hearing. What do you mean, locked away? Sikjin's expression darkened. The company, they had plans for me. Plans I refused to follow. And when I started asking the wrong questions, when I got too close to the truth, he exhaled sharply. They made me disappear. Taehyung's breath hitched. You're lying. Sikjin's eyes flicked to him, something almost like pity in them. I wish I was. Yongi's face was grim. They kept you hidden. For years. Sikjin nodded. They erased me, just like they tried to erase the others. Jungkook's head snapped up. Others. Sikjin's jaw tightened. The original lineup. Taehyung staggered back a step. So it's true. Sikjin's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, and it's worse than you think. Jungkook's chest felt tight. What do you mean? Sikjin hesitated. Then finally, they're still alive. The world seemed to stop. Jungkook felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The original BTS, the ones they had replaced, weren't just forgotten. They were alive. Yongi's voice was sharp. Where? Sikjin's gaze flickered with something dangerous. That's what I've been trying to find out. Jungkook's mind reeled. Then why come to us now? Sikjin's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I finally have a lead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A location. Taehyung took the paper with shaky hands, unfolding it. His eyes scanned the writing, then widened. Yongi leaned over, his expression darkening. No way. Jungkook glanced between them. What is it? Sikjin's voice was steady. The place where everything started. Jungkook looked down at the paper. A single address was scrawled across it. Big Hit's old training building. If we go in there, we might not come back out. Jungkook stared at the address in Taehyung's trembling hands, his heart pounding like a war drum. Big Hit's old training building. The place where they had spent endless nights practicing until their bodies ached. The place where their dreams had first taken shape. And now, the place that held a truth they weren't supposed to find. Yongi exhaled sharply, his wounded shoulder still bleeding through his shirt. We don't have a choice. If the original lineup is alive, we need to find them before they disappear for good. Sikjin glanced around the alley, his posture tense. We need to move. Now. White concave-sided diamond, white concave-sided diamond, white concave-sided diamond. They arrived at the old building just past midnight. It was exactly how Jungkook remembered it, except worse. The once bustling entrance was now abandoned, the glass doors covered in dust and grime. The neon sign that had once proudly displayed Big Hit Entertainment was broken, the letters barely legible. The street was eerily quiet, the air thick with something Jungkook couldn't name, a ghost of their past. Taehyung swallowed hard. This place feels wrong. Sikjin adjusted the gun hidden under his jacket. That's because it is. Yongi pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. The darkness inside seemed to stretch forever, swallowing everything. Jungkook hesitated. Something in his gut screamed at him to turn back. But he couldn't. They stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic. The walls were lined with old posters, photos of trainees long forgotten, their faces frozen in time. A few of them had been ripped, their eyes scratched out. Jungkook shivered. "We shouldn't be here," Taehyung muttered under his breath. Yongi ignored him, leading them deeper into the building. Their footsteps echoed against the cracked tile floor. Every shadow seemed to move. Every breath felt like it could be their last. Then, a noise. A sharp clatter from the end of the hallway. Jungkook's body went rigid. His fingers twitched, instinctively reaching for something, anything, to defend himself. Sikjin's hand went to his gun. "Stay behind me," Yongi whispered. "We're not alone." A faint light flickered from under a door at the far end of the hallway. Jungkook's pulse skyrocketed. That room, that used to be the trainee dorm. Sikjin moved first, his footsteps silent. The others followed, every nerve on edge. The closer they got, the clearer the sounds became. Breathing. Someone was inside. Sikjin reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold under his fingers. He glanced at the others. "Ready?" No one answered, because there was no way to be ready for this. Sikjin turned the handle. The door swung open, and inside, Jungkook's breath caught. There, huddled against the far wall, was a figure. Thin, pale, eyes wide with terror, clothes worn and dirty, as if they had been there for years. A voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Please, don't let them take me again." Jungkook's world shattered. Because he knew that face. He knew that voice. It was one of them. One of the original 7. One of the ones they had replaced. "Please, don't let them take me again." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Jungkook's breath hitched as he took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. The figure in the corner flinched. Even through the dim light, Jungkook could see the truth. This wasn't just some forgotten trainee. This was someone they were never supposed to see again. Someone they had unknowingly replaced. Yongi's voice was barely a whisper. "Joseok?" The figure's shoulders trembled. His eyes, wild, sunken, desperate, snapped to Yongi's. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, "Yongi Hyung?" Jungkook's blood turned to ice. This wasn't possible. Young Joseok had always been with them. Hadn't he? The Joseok they knew. Bright, full of laughter, the heart of BTS. He existed. But this man, this Joseok, looked like a ghost of himself. Sikjin crouched in front of him, his voice careful. "It's really you." Joseok shuddered, gripping his arms as if he were trying to hold himself together. His skin was pale, his lips cracked. I don't know anymore." His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in years. His eyes darted to Jungkook, Taehyung, and Yongi, panic creeping into his expression. "They told me you weren't real, that you were just copies." Jungkook's stomach twisted. "Who told you that?" Joseok exhaled shakily. "Them." Sikjin's jaw clenched. "The company." Yongi crouched beside him, his fingers trembling. "Hobie, what the hell happened to you?" Joseok flinched at the nickname, his breath uneven.